Chapter 2. Danny Fisher caught the rumors in full force as he came through the gate, in a flood of images both true and half-true, and stopping along the gate wall in a shiver of shock, he discovered the general focus of the trouble was the man who had just walked past him. In that time-stretched moment, he realized he knew Stewart. Knew him for a fair man, a borderer, true, but never the bullying sort, far from it. Stewart had sat on a rainy spring evening on Gates' tavern porch, sharing 3 drinks with a kid who at that time could only pay for 1, and telling a towner brat who dared come to a borderer to ask how he could ever hope get the long-distance convoy jobs he dreamed of. Trips the like of which Stewart was clearly born to. Born on. Danny had caught that in the way you knew some things, even when the night horses weren't near, things that just echoed to you. A muddled-headed junior had trouble distinguishing the sources of what he'd gathered out of that moment. Maybe he'd heard them from Stewart himself. Maybe he'd recalled small details from casual remarks Stewart had made earlier at the bar. He didn't know now, but Stewart hadn't grudged information to him. He'd come to Stewart, half expecting ridicule, or worse, an indecent proposition, borderers having no good repute among lowland riders. He'd been mortally scared and desperate walking up to that table, offering to buy Stewart a drink in return for his question. And Stewart must have picked up on that fear. Stewart had laughed, given him an amused and immediate calm down he was spoken for. And because Stewart's burn and his own cloud had both been nearby, he'd caught the image of the rider who'd laid personal claim to guile Stewart. Beautiful. Beautiful rider. Beautiful seat. Maybe glossed by Stewart's memory, he didn't know that either, but he'd been instantly set off his balance and mortified with embarrassment. Because, of course, he'd realized Stewart had read his suspicions of him through and through. But now, watching the man walk out of the gate alone to face some kind of bad news that Danny suddenly, illogically felt centered on that woman so important to Stewart, he shivered in the unmistakable darkness and skittishness in the horses' minds, wished he could do something. He felt outraged when someone muttered "borderer" in that tone that implied Stewart and trouble deserved each other. It wasn't fair. He almost blurted out something to that effect, junior that he was, but talking out of turn could start what he by no means could finish. It was a group of Shaughnessy men, 6 of them, years senior to him, and you didn't contradict the seniors. Then he heard first, aloud, from the same group, the word rogue horse, and almost lost his supper, because it at once echoed off everything that had brought him running out of town. Rogue was that going apart. He'd heard a rider tell about it, a man who didn't need to say he'd talked to someone who'd personally seen it, because the images had carried a detail and a feeling that haunted a junior's sleep for nights after. But Rogue couldn't have anything to do with Stewart, or Byrne, or Stewart's beautiful border woman. It couldn't. That awful word didn't happen down in Shaughnessy lowlands. It was campfire stories. It was ghost tales around the hostile fires in deep winter. Other riders had objected just to the telling of the story with the horses at hand. They said it was irresponsible to pass that image at night when things were spookier. A word that belonged up in the highlands, in the extremes of dangers riders and horses faced up there, and you always hoped they'd exaggerated. Some creature, a horse or a bear usually, got brain injured and started doing things a sane one just wouldn't do, sending at a range a sane one couldn't send, coming right into encampments to kill, playing canny games with trackers while it hunted its hunters. It didn't, for God's sake, come down to Shaughnessy gates and civilized territory to trouble a town a Shaughnessy size. It didn't touch someone he knew in real life or disturb his family at their own dinner table. The tail end of the convoy had just filed by the open camp gate on its way into the city gates, headlights shining into the twilight, and behind that last truck he could see Stewart cross the road to meet with the riders waiting there, all mounted, all waiting. He had the most terrible feeling then, like chill, like forewarning. He suddenly realized he was picking up expectations out of the ambient. Every horse around them was disturbed by what they picked up from human minds, like a buzz of gossip. Everyone anticipating, dreading, wanting calamity to the man they were watching. That feeling around the gate grew stiflingly close, charged and irrational. Rogue, rogue, rogue kept circling through his mind, and maybe others. That dark, nasty feeling that clicked into place with a clear impression of a twilit mountainside, a memory so specific he could have recognized that place if he ever been there. Different than he'd felt with the man who told a story and given impressions into the ambient secondhand. Right now, he felt something so powerful, so horrible, so present with them. Dead, he kept hearing. Words as human talked. Dead, dead, dead. While Stuart stood on the other side of the road and out of earshot, arms folded, head down, mostly so one couldn't read his face as he talked with the mounted riders. Then a sudden crisis hit the ambient. Danny held his breath as Stuart abruptly strode away from the meeting and turned upslope on the grassy hill, heading away from the camp. The three riders who had spoken with Stuart held their horses still, and Danny felt a terrible, smothering fear, so vivid it became his own and made his heart race. Autumn leaves, rocks, blood. He put out a hand to find something solid. His fingers met rough bark. His eyes told him it was a tree trunk on the mountainside along that perilous road, but his brain knew it was only the palisade wall. Sight dimmed, senses drowning. Some other rider jostled him, likewise on the retreat. Everyone was clearing the area. Then a wild squeal erupted out of the dark behind the gates, a heart-stopping squalling. "Let him go!" someone shouted aloud, shouted in the camp. The sound shocked the air as a night horse broke through the thin screen of bystanders, not bolting uncontrolled into the dusk, but treading cat-footed, shaking his mane and throwing off such a cold feeling of ill that senior riders crowded each other to get out of its path. It imaged itself in a violence that raced over raw nerves and ran red. It whipped its tail then, crossed the road, and spooked the messenger's horses as it launched itself uphill towards Stuart, running full out. He scarcely saw Stuart catch its mane as it cut across his path on the hill. Stuart swung up in a stride, a solid piece with the darkness that raced along the shadowy grass of the hillside. They ran and ran until Danny couldn't see them any longer with his eyes. Only the feeling of and remained, shivering down his arms and disturbing his heart. Meanwhile, the three riders who'd met with Stuart crossed the road, coming quietly towards the camp gates. A darkness themselves, mind and body, they and their horses. The men nearest the gates began to push them shut, as if they could wall that menace out. For an instant, the feeling in the air was horrid, full of death. The gate closers gave back, mission not accomplished, as the riders came through. Danny shrank back against the wall, breath dammed up, his head swimming with visions of blood and rocks as those riders passed, and his nerves feeling far worse, the separation, the taking apart that he hadn't recognized when he first felt it in the town. The anguish and the anger of a rider's death rippled and echoed through the area around Shaughnessy Gates like a stone tossed into a quiet pond. Something warm breathed on his neck then, a presence that had slipped up on him, quiet as a breeze, a frightened, spooky mind that didn't like what it smelled, saw, felt from the strangers, and meant to safeguard his rider from them. He didn't need to ask, and he tried not to image, which did no good at all. He turned and reached for the refuge of Cloud's midnight neck, tangled his fists in Cloud's mane, stood there in the shelter of Cloud's warmth, only then beginning to shiver. Cloud was imaging. It was the same image he had seen, the same image the strangers had brought with them through Shamasy camp gates, and the face of the dead rider was, he was increasingly sure, Stuart's border woman. Stuart's grief came shivering through him then, as if it were washing off the hills. The iron bell that tolled for inbound and outbound convoys began to ring again, distraction to horse and rider senses. They would drink tonight. They would dance, make love, anything to numb this. That, in Danny's young experience, was a proper rider funeral. But there was no joy, no celebration of life. Violence boded everywhere about. Murder raced out into the hills and echoed off the slopes into the streets of the camp. He'd only heard the faint stirrings of that anger, that bitter, killing rage let loose in the town, disturbing the streets, maybe reaching his family, maybe prompting the anger at the table. But here it rang through his bones and stirred the pain of his jaw where his father had hit him. Here, it prompted him to rage next to tears. The violence, that confusion that had broken forth in the camp, now, in force, threatened all of them. He felt it tugging at his reason. He saw it in the eyes of the small boy who wove his way past the leather-fringed elbows of the rider crowd. He recognized that thin white face as someone familiar to him, and didn't even realize for a heartbeat that he was looking at his own brother Dennis. In that moment, he saw Dennis as he'd never seen his brother before, a thin, scraggy, amount-to-nothing kid. He saw how fear and hard work were settling a mark on Dennis that was on their father, on their mother, on Sam. It was death happening. It was the damned, doomed mark of the masses who huddled in walled towns, the sons and daughters of starfarers, as the preachers constantly reminded them, afraid of the world they lived in. Dennis came running and grabbed him around the middle, terrified, wanting him. Danny shoved back as Cloud's fright hit his nerves. He struck out instinctively just to get Dennis away from Cloud, screaming, "Get out of here! Get out of here! Go home, you brainless little fool!" In the next instant, he felt the sting in his hand and saw Dennis sitting on the ground with a hand pressed to his cheek, all shock and hurt, tears in his eyes. The shock he felt was what stopped Cloud. That was all that stopped Cloud, until he turned and shoved desperately at Cloud's muscular shoulder, trying to image the Cloud that this wasn't an enemy, this was a part of him. He ordered Cloud to go away, and Cloud surged against him in a fit of jealous anger. "No!" he said, shoving back, and imaged Cloud sent back. "Behave yourself!" Night horses understood some words, more than a few words, when they wanted to. Danny was mad now, and Cloud was mad, but he was madder and scared. It was his brother's life at stake. "Dennis!" That did no good. Cloud was angry at the people, angry at the boy, and Cloud didn't want to know who Dennis was. The complexities of human family relations were beyond Cloud's imagining. Danny shoved hard at Cloud's shoulder. "Go away if you can't behave, Cloud. Go away. Now!" Cloud shook his neck, an obscuring flurry and flutter of his mane, then backed a step and whirled with a stinging lash of his tail. But he sulked a little distance away from them, temperous and snapping at an equally surly horse in his immediate path. Danny turned towards Dennis then, not wanting to deal with the boy, still trembling as if he were with Cloud's fighting anger. But Dennis wasn't there. He'd not felt him go. Cloud hadn't told him he'd left. It wasn't important to Cloud. Damn it. There would be murders by morning. When the camp shook to night horse dreams, the slum of Shamasy caught the fever. Old feuds, old angers, old resentments would boil up in the taverns and the horses tonight. The rich sat safely insulated in town center, but no one in or near the camp palisade could be immune from the madness that had broken loose. When all the camp swarmed with images, when all the riders had the same dread of their own dark imaginings. Clearly, a Shamasy kid who'd left the common path had no place in his own home tonight. He couldn't face his father or his mother or his brothers, especially not Dennis, a realization which settled and occupied a numb, vaguely angry spot in his heart. He thought he ought to feel overwhelming remorse, loss, something. He knew in his head why his father had hit him. He even forgave his father in his heart the way the preacher said he had to do. He knew the desperation his father felt in the face of his middle son's sure damnation, and his middle son's tempting Sam and Dennis and their mother to go down that same hellhound road. But that road was his breath of life. What he held dearest and most vital violated everything his father held rational or sacred. He couldn't possibly explain to his brothers what he felt when he touched Cloud. His father called it proselytizing for the devil, leading his brothers into temptation. So he'd personally rejected God. He hadn't meant to, but once he'd begun to hear the beast, he'd begun to hear the whole world as it spiraled out to winter in licentious riot. He'd felt it in the urgency of all life, even of townsmen and the placid cattle that had come down from the stars with them. Delicious feelings, forbidden feelings his parents didn't talk about, and he could only hint at with his friends because they weren't, he'd understood, the feelings his friends had. They were constant. They were preoccupying. Pictures in his mind and feelings that charged over those pictures with sensations that ran over his skin and roused desires he had to seek privacy to deal with. He'd prayed, and the pictures came into his prayers. He'd worked until he sweated, and he felt his own skin alive to the air. He lived now in the flux of beast-sent images that invaded his mind moment by moment. He shivered in the feelings of lust and anger that alternately took his body, the outpourings of disturbed minds, when he should be repenting for hitting Dennis and defying his father. Except, no matter what his father believed, riders did have feelings the preachers would call good. Even the horses had them, a thing no rider could explain to the preachermen, a thing riders couldn't even tell each other, it just was. When you got a number of horses together, and enough riders to pin their thoughts obsessively on a set of images, they said you could hear beyond the stone's toss that was a horse's ordinary range. Shamasy regularly proved it, and the pain people felt tonight was because riders couldn't ignore each other. He couldn't ignore the rider out there, alone. He couldn't forget the pain that had rung through Shamasy camp, that still rang in the iron tolling of the bell. The images tumbled one over the other in his skull, the woman, the rocks, the blood. He didn't easily distinguish. They said a rider's ability to judge such things got better over time. What was his memory of what he'd just seen imaged, and what he might be hearing from riders in the camp, or at this very moment, even from Stuart, at a range no night horse was supposed to attain. Horses in pain reached inexplicable distances, did things they weren't supposed to know how to do. Junior riders said so, around their own fires. He never heard a senior rider say it, but that horse's pain, which he thought he'd felt when he'd had his hand directly on Cloud, had gone straight to his nerves in a transferred disturbance of a nature and subtlety he'd never heard before. If that was the source of it. The pain and the anger running the hills out there could be why he'd hit Dennis, recoiling from Dennis's emotional outburst as he ran to him. Cloud could only see that wild emotion as an attack on his rider, and Dennis didn't know. Dennis couldn't feel the air around him. A boy who understood only Shamasy slum couldn't begin to believe that things in the outside world didn't feel or react the way he did. And Dennis was his own world, being 12 going on 13, and in that world of all things he believed as so, Dennis could only know his older brother had gone crazy with his horse and slapped him to the ground. So much for Danny, Dennis would think. Go on and go to hell. Dennis didn't need him anyway. He could hear it as if Dennis had yelled it at him without Cloud's help. So, that was well enough. He couldn't make Dennis see it, and Dennis had some major adjustments to the world as it was yet to make, some edges yet to be worn off his hell-bent sense of right and proper. Dennis had it in him. Dennis could learn. Dennis wasn't Sam. But God, he didn't need to have hit the kid that hard, no matter that Dennis was being an ass. The way his father, equally scared, equally angry, seeing him in danger, had hit him, the camp gate shut, the bar dropped. Cloud venturing close to him again, spooked off with an angry whoof of breath, the wildness Cloud had before storms, deserting him as the other night horses, gathering here and there among the riders, shifted and snorted in the gathering dark. A group of them spooked off the same way Cloud had, a muted thunder down the streets, towards the further reaches of the camp. The riders around him turned up their collars against the night wind, thrust their hands into their pockets, and shying from their own horses, went back into the commons, onto the street, to go back to their own precincts, or into the tavern to drink and to numb the feeling, to kill the anger, as all strong feelings had to die quickly in the huge, unstable assemblage of Shamasy Camp. It was the rule. Danny joined the general drift down to the commons, trying to subdue his own bit of that prickling storm sense, trying to forget the set-to with Dennis, trying to forget his father shouting at him and telling him go to hell. Everyone was on edge. His father had, he was increasingly convinced, been feeling the rogue sending when he'd hit him. His own nerves had certainly been at the snapping point when he did Dennis, and Dennis had been on the raw edge to run at him, risking Cloud's vicinity, when ordinarily Cloud scared Dennis out of reach. He never seen mind-to-mind panic in action. Although the boss man, Lyle Wesson, had had the universal talk with him, when first he and Cloud had come into the camp, novices, confused and hostile and scared of everyone and everything. The camp boss had told him in plain words that being young, he was bound to be stupid with his feelings at least several times, and that he had better get control of his emotions fast, or find himself out on solitary cattle watch for the next 3 moon chases. He remembered that brush of Stewart's presence at the gates now, when his own insides had been in turmoil and his brain hadn't been thinking. He'd wanted. He ached for company, the way Stewart ached for company in these precarious autumn days. And Stewart's border woman was for some reason the image that kept coming at him as if it were his own loss, the unattainable substance of his wishes. A beautiful, fringe-jacketed rider in the high wild, copper-haired woman, with the red leaves on all the hills, the object of more than one of his furtive midnight fantasies. He was disgusted with himself, finding his own juvenile privations echoing off Stewart's earnest grief. It wasn't even remotely forgivable. God! The rider Stewart loved was a mangled corpse, and the images running horribly under the surfaces of the minds around him. Stewart's private pain was echoing at him out of the night, and he had had thoughts like that. No wonder even Cloud wouldn't stay by him, in the confusion of mating urges he was feeling in his blood. It was too painful and drove Cloud too crazy, when there was enough craziness natural in the edge of winter ambient. He didn't know why he should ache after a woman he'd never even met, a borderer who wouldn't have given a junior a passing glance on his best day. But Stewart had passed that close to him, with horses nearby, and a human mind, he suspected by now, was a flittery, fragile thing, very much unsure what belonged to it by experience and what came to it from elsewhere. Or, shuddery thought, if it was Stewart he was still hearing, if it was Stewart's thought coming at them from the hills across the road, by all he knew, by all he'd heard, also at a winter fireside, only rogues could send like that. But Stewart wasn't. His horse wasn't rogue. He wouldn't believe it. Chains of such misfortune were legendary, one rogue triggering the next, but it was all stupid ghost stories, that was all. Horses, and sometimes bears and cats, did legitimately go rogue. That part was real. Horses got kicked in the head in some mating fight, or got a high fever that damaged the brain. And a rogue horse, probably a wild one, there were wild herds on Rogers Peak, had spooked that convoy up in the mountains and sent a rider and her horse off the edge of the road. All that was true. But now, and for no sane reason, all of a sudden Rogue Rider was echoing around the ambient, fear spreading out to attack Abby Dale's partner, as if Stuart had just gone unstable, just like the ghost stories, only because he'd run from the camp and gone out alone. But wasn't that something you were supposed to do if you couldn't hold something in? Get away from the horses, get calm, get quiet? Stuart wasn't crazy. Stuart wasn't any rogue. It wasn't fair or reasonable for people to think so, was it? He questioned the dark, but Cloud didn't answer him. Either Cloud had gotten out of range, or Cloud was refusing all dealing with him until he'd gotten himself in hand. He thought, trying to calm his rattled nerves. He very much wanted Cloud's comfort right now. He wanted Cloud to be near him. But nothing came back but constant. Now came the erotic urges of horses heading into winter rut. Sex and rivalry and anger. So much anger, no focus, and so much fear of instability. He couldn't even image as disturbed as he was. He looked at the ground as he walked, at the dust gaslit from the poles in the tavern yard, determined to notice detail. That was a last mindless defense against an invading image. He strove to see individual grains of dust and the half-colored texture the gaslights and the lantern light gave to the ground. He noticed how the footprints in that dust were different, the town-made boots, and the ones more individual, borderers, the sharp, tripartite hoofprints of the horses under and over them. In that preoccupation, he came up among the tables where the commons gave way to gate tavern territory. Under the gaslights were old I can't say this name, but I'm going to try. Mastrayan. Where old Mastrayan had his hands full. Mastrayan's town help were bringing out ale by the pitcherful. Nervous kids, slum kids glad to have any job, even ones the preacher said risked their souls, and working along with them, rider kids, as yet horseless, and a few riders so new or so young they welcomed a tavern job to keep themselves and their horses fed. Forage being no viable choice in Shamsey's civilized lowland, where even open pasture had owners. He was a second-year junior. He was far richer than that. He had his winter account with the camp boss, money for camp store, the hostel he stayed in, and another account with Mastrayan, beyond what he'd given his family in Shamsey. He'd even carried a little cash in his belt purse, and the tavern would thank a customer for cash tonight, he was sure, from anyone who carried it. There were just too many customers, over half the camp having followed the disturbance to the gates, for the harried staff to keep tabs. So he laid down a 5 on the porch-side counter, in exchange for which the counter help handed him an empty mug. He found himself at an empty place at a table, shoulder to shoulder at the end of a long bench, with other juniors, and a couple who didn't look at all to be juniors, men and women. Maybe even borderers, he wasn't sure. A mug and 5 meant you could sit at a table, pour from the pitchers the server set out, and drink yourself gradually stupid, which he was determined to tonight for the first time in his life. His father would be furious if he knew, and quote the preachers about ale and riot. His mother would be disgusted, and say he was a stupid kid in bad company, squandering money. Of course, squandering was his mother's word. It didn't matter if it was your money. If you spent money or time on something she didn't like, you were squandering it. He was never so conscious of the wall divided the camp from the town, and him from his family. He'd never had a hangover. He wondered, was it as bad as some seniors said? He'd spent more money plastering his family's walls than he'd ever squandered in the Gate Tavern. He'd bought clothes and gear he had to have, nothing extravagant. He'd bought sweets for Cloud, who didn't at least cry over how wonderful the money was and call him a sinner damned to hell in the same evening. The high, reedy sound of a flute had started up. Another joined in oscillating discord. And then the drummers started a wild and noisy rhythm. Nobody could be planning sleep in the surrounding hostels tonight. A flood of riders left their tables and started dancing in the commons, some with drinks in hand, men and women in a mingled line. His table mostly cleared in that first wave, and he refilled his mug and joined what was getting to be a rowdy first dance line. A handful of borderers had started a contest of sorts, the showouts holding forth inside the meandering lines. Lowland riders didn't do the borderers' steps, didn't do the single dances like that. He wouldn't dare go out with them, but he watched, asking himself if he could keep his balance, if he could do those steps, and trying a couple of them in the line dance. He found a couple of juniors, both male and girlless, when the line broke up into sets. They danced through one mug and a refill. He didn't know one of them except as Lane, a kid from the far side of Shaughnessy Slum himself. He didn't like Lane much, but that was no requisite for sets. They danced themselves breathless and drank half the refill down. Then a couple of borderers, already way too many ales down, were spinning past each other with knives flashing, coat fringes flying. The set lines bowed out for fear of mishaps, while the drummers went crazy, and the hired help dodged down the line, filling outheld mugs and spilling astonishingly little. "Follow not the beast," the preacher said. "Avoid ale and riot. Dance is the devil's enticement." He had his mug refilled without asking, without noticing it was about to happen, and out of breath, tried a few of the steps he'd seen. Arms hooked his of a sudden, and he found himself snatched and spun into another set, arms snagged by two sweating men he didn't know, both drunker than he was, and as suddenly found himself spun out into a dance circle, where two borderers beckoned him in, wanting him, he feared, to play the female third. "No knives," he panted, and the two, holding each other up, roared with laughter, grabbed his free arm, and snatched him into a dizzy circle dance. Then he just concentrated on footwork to the drum, round and round and round, with gulps from the mug in between, matching their consumption the way he matched their steps. Sweat was pouring down his face despite the chill. He'd picked up the step and thought he was doing damned well at it. The beat became the whole night, the whole universe, so long as his balance lasted. But after 2 rounds, he'd no breath for anything but to take the good-natured, hard slaps of high country riders on his shoulders and weave away, thank God, still able to find his way to a table and sit down before he made a public, staggering fool of himself. A server filled his mug. He'd lost count of how many he'd had out there. Assured of a stable bench under his backside, he sipped the ale, not because he wanted the alcohol, but to ease a throat raw and dry from panting. Most of the dancers were still going, but the 2 borderers, after deriding the junior for flagging, had fallen down at other tables. The sounds he heard now were all of drums and flutes, the sights all whirling bodies, recollection of gaslights spinning past. Human images, human company. Humans couldn't image to each other without the horses close, and with the horses absent, human minds could go quiet, exhausted, blind, deaf, and voiceless. The rogue presence was gone, its burden lifted. Funerals ought to be loud and raucous, and one could hope the dead woman could somehow know they'd thrown a good one. Borderer that she was, the camp she'd been intending for her winter over, at least knew she was gone, and in that acknowledged they were all mortal. They wished the dead rider a good hereafter, if there was one, or at least wished themselves drank and danced in noise enough to make the dead hear the party. It might ease Stuart's mind if he heard the drums out there in the dark. He hoped Stuart did not know he and the red-haired woman, or he hoped Stuart did know he and the red-haired woman had friends in camp. He hoped Stuart might come in and have a drink and sit and mourn insanity, giving the lie to the fools who, in their stupid, idle speculation, put the rogue business on the man who'd only loved that rider. Because he'd made them feel it. He'd shoved it at them hard, and their nerves were jangled. God, he wanted his family to be safe tonight. He wanted to know if Dennis had made it home to bed before the craziness started in the town, as he very much feared it could. It would be better in town once the dancing had started and the angers fell in camp. It would be better for the town if, in the Shaughnessy taverns, there could be dancing too, or prayers in the churches, or whatever calmed hearts and tempers, since the preachers said dancing was the devil's way. No question that the slum could hear the drums. Many the nights of his life he'd heard the like from that third-floor flat, lying in his bed, scared of devils. His family would hear the drums and flutes tonight, and know that there was dancing going on. His mother would be angry, and his father would be praying to God to forgive their wayward Danny for dancing and for drinking, and for being with low minds. That was what his father called it, words he surely gotten from the preachers. Low minds, consorters with the beasts. He'd not asked to be a rider. But nobody, not even the boss man, and he had asked that among the first agonized questions he'd ever dared ask the boss. Nobody knew why horses picked somebody, or why, as the boss said, they'd sometimes travel unaccountably long distances in search of someone, the way Cloud had done for him. Cloud had just, in the autumn of his second year, wandered down to Shaughnessy looking for someone of a description that somehow he guessed happened to fit. Maybe Cloud had had no prospects in the high villages. Maybe he'd been so persnickety that he decided to search a really big town just because there were more to choose from. Cloud had been persistent about it once he arrived. He had hung about Shaughnessy Hills, coming down to the town gate at night, scaring hell out of the gate guards. The whole town had heard that the night watch had been shooting at a horse, which so far they'd been lucky enough to miss, and the town council had been recipient of an angry ultimatum from the riders, who took strong exception to the firing. At the time, he'd been solidly on the gate guard's side, frightened for his town, believing absolutely in his father's hell, and night after night, suffering strange dreams nobody else, he'd tried to figure out if he was the only case, admitted to. He'd been steadily losing sleep and having nightmares about the gates and the gunfire ever since what the kids called the devil horse had shown up. His dreams had finally grown so vivid and his mind so sleep-cheated and frantic that after a long day of agonizing on the prospect of another night of such dreams, he'd marched down to the camp to protest to any rider he could find that he was a good, God-fearing kid, to state that the riders were clearly responsible for protecting townsfolk, and to ask that rider how to stop hearing it. The rider he'd asked at the safe limit of the gate had taken him, in his extreme reluctance, right inside the camp where he'd never been, and straight to the camp boss, whereupon the boss had looked him up and down for the scrawny, unlikely kid that he was, and drawled, as if there was certainly no accounting for taste. "The horse wants you. That's all." Then the boss man had asked him his name, and said he'd be living in the camp soon, told him plainly that he didn't really have any choice about it, that when a wild horse was sending like that, and you started feeling it as that personal, then pretty soon you were going to start hearing everything that came along. Every little burrower at Meadow's Edge, every bird that perched on the roof trees. The world would never be quiet to you, ever after. The boss man had said that if you got a call and lost that horse, you'd never ever sleep again. And probably you'd go crazy. So he might as well take a hike into the hills and let the horse find him. The boss man had lied to him, he found out. He'd actually had a choice, but in the conviction that he hadn't, he'd walked out of the gate tavern and lost his breakfast right at the camp gate. He'd been so scared of hellfire. Then he'd heard the horse in broad daylight. He'd seen it waiting for him in the hills across the road. Hills he couldn't even see with his eyes from inside the gate. He'd been getting images that strongly from that far away. He'd never realize it. Clouds across the stars, that was the way Cloud called himself. Clouds scudding fast before a storm wind. You couldn't say all of it aloud, with the rain smell and the shivery chill and all, and he'd been completely, helplessly swallowed up in it. He'd seen nothing but that starry sky when he'd begun to climb that same grassy slope that Stuart had run, and met, past that hilltop and another one, a horse that decided finally it had found a fool who satisfied its juvenile itches. Found a fool that knew where to scratch, of course. Cloud was a glutton for human fingers. Found a town-bred fool who'd fall off and near break his neck half a dozen times before he quit insisting he was going one way, when Cloud knew very well he was going another. It hadn't been easy for a young fool in any sense. Bruised and skinned on various parts of his body he'd been when he'd written down a message to his family and sent it by a town kid. He'd thought a lot about hell in the 2 days he waited for an answer from his family. He'd said in that message, "I can make more money being a writer," because his father and his mother understood money. He'd said, "We can get the apartment fixed. We can buy a new drill, one of those electrics. We can bring in a line." He knew his father lusted after that most of all. His mother had written back. He still kept that letter folded up in the lining of his coat. "Your father hasn't accepted it yet, but he says you can come in. He doesn't want to hear about the horse. Come to supper Sunday. We won't talk about the camp." And that had been the agreement, the condition under which he was acceptable at his family's dinner table. That and the money he brought, his evident prosperity. As things were now, a lump started gathering in his throat, and he washed it down with forbidden ale. Now it might be a while before Mama could talk Papa into Sunday dinners again. Maybe Papa's anger would stretch into winter. There wasn't much time left in the year. You couldn't get higher in winter to speak of, but there was spring when all the goods had to move at once, and if he could somehow come back next spring with a lot of money, Papa would be happier. And they might have worried about him, a little, if they didn't hear from him. He could sit in camp all winter and not write, just to let them worry. Let them wonder if he was mad at them, or if he was all right. Papa just didn't like to think about the drums and the drinking and the fornication. That was what Papa called it. He hadn't ever had any chance to fornicate himself, but it wasn't something you could argue with Papa. In Papa's mind, fornication and wickedness was what went on in the camp all the time, and after the work of summer and fall, winter was one long misbehavior. That was what Papa called it when Papa was being delicate in front of Dennis. When Papa was mad, however, he found that Papa had other words, some of which he hadn't even heard from his friends in Shamousy streets. Words that made him mad, and made him ask what you learned in church when you got to be father's age. He never had that in his lessons. But if he'd outraged his father and embarrassed him in front of the church by showing up in rider style, he'd profoundly embarrassed his mother, who had to face the neighbors and her customers, and them, of course, all asking questions, like where the money come to paint the apartment, and what went on in the camp, and she wouldn't know. She wasn't interested in hearing it from him. But nobody was going to believe she didn't. That was the position he'd put his family in. The preacher said once, you started hearing the beasts of the world, you couldn't never stop. You couldn't come back. Because once you heard one, then you started hearing all the beasts, even a little one. So you slipped deeper and deeper into damnation and became like a beast yourself. That was one thing the preacher said that had turned out to be true, but not quite the way it said. It wasn't like hearing words. Sometimes you just see things when you were riding out and about the hills. You'd see yourself and your horse going down the road, and you know you were picking something up from some little creature somewhere, under the bushes or up the hill, and it just wasn't that bad. They were gentle images most times, a little spooky towards dark, but you learned very quickly to tell what was sending it. And mostly the feelings they brought with them were anxiousness or curiosity. Very few wild creatures wanted to come near a night horse. As for the sex his parents imagined, God, that was a joke. If you were a town-bred junior, you could just lay in the dark when the images came past you from somebody else, as they did, and you tried to imagine you'd found some rider girl who didn't think you were pond scum. But there weren't many girls among the juniors. Shamousy girls didn't come out to the horses. They were too scared of hellfire, or no horse had ever wanted one, and there were rider girls, but they all had boys they'd grown up with. So that left a Shamousy rider on his own at night. But oh, there were women who came into camp, full of mysteries a 16-year-old couldn't possibly deal with. Women in fringed leather and carrying knives, sun-tanned and wonderful. Women who'd bunked down mostly with senior riders they personally knew. A lot richer than he was, and not needing a junior to tell them his sweaty palmed aspirations. The horses eavesdropped at the same time, and sometimes spread feelings all through the den, until, if you were in the vicinity, God help you. Cloud was a pushy horse and devious, and Cloud flirted with all the mares. Cloud drove him crazy sometimes, like now. He finally knew exactly where Cloud was, in the dark of the den by the gate, not that far out of Cloud's range, and Cloud was excited. And Cloud was sniffing after a mare who was more than interested. He couldn't stop it. It wasn't even his right to stop it. The boss man had told him that, and the boss man could as well have left it off the list of particulars. Cloud would have made him know his rights and dues beyond any doubt at all. The dancing was still going on, a little slower, as everybody ran out of wind, but craziness was running the camp, with the autumn cold in the air. So, of course, when he was so buzzed he staggered, Cloud, with the images of blood and dead females in his head, had to think of tonight of sex. God, Cloud had no sense of moderation. Nor did the mare. Damnation, the preacher said. A night horse had no kindness. Animals had no souls. Well, Cloud had no shame, that was sure, and he didn't know how to be near human beings when Cloud was doing what Cloud was doing at the moment. He'd danced enough and drunk enough. He decided he better stagger off the bed, which, wobbly as he was just too far, and a cheaper hostel clear around the circuit of the camp. He only needed a place for an hour or so where nobody would bother him, where he could suffer Cloud's maid courting in private and sober up enough to walk home, and he didn't want... Oh, God. He had to get up fast, dazed as he was. He couldn't stay in the tavern yard. He stood a moment while images came and went to be sure of his feet. Then he wandered through the area of the dance, walked his unsteady way down the street towards the night horse den next the gate, which sense told him was where Cloud was doing his courting. And that's the end of chapter 2. As we got towards the end of that one, I think you all figured out why this book is not exactly for kids. It does feature a 16-year-old protagonist, but it features a 16-year-old protagonist in the way sci-fi in the 80s and 90s featured them, which is to say, just because the authors wanted someone who was a little bit less than self-controlled. See, sci-fi in that era, I don't know if anyone's noticed, did its best work with people who would act kind of irrationally, who would act the most human. Less logical characters made for great sci-fi fodder. And the easiest way to get less logical characters was to make them younger. Rider at the Gate does this. Our main character is 16. Of course, Ender's Game famously did this for the first book. The second book, of course, he's a full-grown man, but he has children, I believe, if I remember correctly. The He-Chi trilogy, one I love a lot, had an older main character, but man, did he act like a teenager. So it's because sci-fi really wants to explore the nature of the human being, which is why we're already getting a lot of fun juxtaposition between religion and reality here, where the religion from beyond the stars can't quite account for these alien things that make up reality and try to fit them in a box they don't exactly fit in, instead of making a new box, which would be the proper reaction to a new thing. New things need new boxes if they can't be categorized in old boxes. But if your thinking is too rigid, you can't make a new box, and thus you get religion like this that sounds like, honestly, when I say Western sci-fi, doesn't it feel like it? We've got taverns and dancing and preachers shouting about damnation. You could go watch any old spaghetti Western and get exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. The only thing that's different is the preachers have to deal with psychic horses instead of just the call of the road, rambunctiousness, and misdemeanors. Which is, what most preachers in a spaghetti Western would deal with, except for the psychic horses. So it's pretty much exactly the same, but with a fun sci-fi kind of fantasy tint to it that gives you some interesting opportunities as the story goes on to examine some parts of human nature that normally you wouldn't get to. Where sci-fi really shines, in my opinion, is when it gets to explore parts of human nature that other genres can't. A Western can explore many of these same ideas, but it can't do it in quite the same way, and it can't do it quite as deep. Westerns are better for exploring the nature of a man and his duty, which is why most Westerns are about that very thing. They're good for exploring themes of revenge and religion. But this science fiction novel, as you're going to see, is better suited to exploring themes of what makes a mind, what makes emotions, what makes understanding and reason and logic. And we'll get to see that because we have to parse it out between this and the mind of an animal. And we have to try and figure that out. So it makes overall a wonderful juxtaposition that allows us to have more insight than we would normally get from a story about a horse and a boy, because it's a psychic horse, which means we get to hear more about the boy. And in fact, the nature of the human being, it's less about the boy himself and more about the nature of humanity.